Hello, BookTube. And I was going to come to you with a wrap up of week two of New World's November. Excuse me. But I thought I'd do something else. I found something that's quite interesting that I'd like to share. Um, I've shown some of these before. It's a sort of American edition, sorry, the British editions of American anthologies in science fiction in the late 40s and into the 50s. Mostly 50s, I should say. And they're basically stripped down versions, abridged if you want to call them, but the stories themselves that are in each of them are not abridged. They're just, there's less stories in. Like this one here, really cool cover. It's the best science fiction stories. It started in 1949, edited by Everett F. Bleiler and T.E. Dikty. And every Everett F. Bleiler was a bibliographer, an expert in early science fiction, as well as fantasy and crime and detective fiction. He sort of came out in the late 40s with a seminal book, which was a checklist, just a listing. It was about 450 pages, a small little book that's maybe even a little smaller than this, but it was like a seminal book of everything that was fantastic, not necessarily science fiction, but fantastic qualities, including fantasy and everything too, or things even like P.G. Woodhouse's Laughing Gas was in there, and it's just a story where a boy and a man are at the dentist, and they get put under with laughing gas, and they swap bodies. Their minds swap bodies. So that's a fantastic thing. So that's the kind of stuff that was in there, and it was a seminal one that there was so much in there, and it was published by Shasta Press, one of the big three publishers at the time, Shasta Fantasy Press, and Gnome were sort of the big three. But anyway, this year it's got this year was published in 1949, the American version. I'm pretty sure this is the one that matches up. And in this cut down version, there is one, two, three, 6, 7, 8. So I think there's what 13 or 14 in the original one. And anyway, this has a really interesting introduction to it. It's a short introduction by Vincent Starrett. Um, oh, I just wanted to say T.E. Dikty. They did a lot of stuff. They did about 10 years of something like this. He did several other things as well. Edited, and he was primarily editor, but he also started Starmont Publications, which gave it was a specialty nonfiction publisher in science fiction, and also too, which developed out of all this are the Starmont Guides, which are very like about 80 pages study of given science fiction authors, and there's a huge list of them. They've become quite collectible. Some of them have been reprinted with god awful covers that are just sort of white and black or something, but the originals had nice drawings. Anyway, that's him. And then the introduction here, though, was by Vincent Starrett. He wrote like Sherlock Holmes pastiches, quite a few crime fiction, as well as an article in, I think it was the Tribune, the Chicago Tribune, um, about books. He was a bibliophile and collector, and there's collections of his articles and essays on books. He was a Canadian. He grew up in Toronto above his father's bookshop before the family moved to Chicago. Anyway, this is the introduction, and it's a really, really great introduction. There are things that place it in the time here, and which what is that? This is 1950. Well, 51, first published July 51. This is second impression, March 1952. But I'd like to read the introduction. Too many years ago, when I was a small Canadian lost in a brave new world of books, some of my favorite stories were those tremendous entertainments based on marvels, which, in my innocence, I took to be wild impossibilities. If there is one word that will describe my preferred reading in that enchanted pocket of time, perhaps the word is mystery, which includes ghosts, buried treasure, solitary horsemen, sunken continents, and lively ladies guarded by monsters. But of almost any aspect of the world's quest for new horizons stood high on my list. As it was my good fortune to be born in the last quarter of the 19th century and to grow up in a bookshop, there was no lack of any of these literary properties to stir my imagination. The convenient term science fiction had not yet been invented, I believe, but in large part that is what I was reading. With the sure instinct of a budding critic, I abjured the pious little tracts thrust upon me by certain elders. Miss Tuesey's Mission was one of them, I remember, and read everything by Jules Verne that I could lay my hands on. A little later, when I looked into H.G. Wells, it was with emotions similar to those inspired in Keats on first looking into Chapman's Homer. Really, my taste in these last days of the old century was rather good. Today, after some 60 years of eye strain and armchair adventuring, it gives me pleasure to remember that I cut my teeth on a literary genre that seems at length to have reached full public consciousness and that recently has been called the most extraordinary literary phenomenon of our time. But particularly in those days, I read the strange stories of a doctor named Arthur Conan Doyle, uh, in which I found science, adventure, romance, and even humor blended after a fashion so agreeable to my palate that no other writer to this moment has ever pleased me more. In short, while little more than an infant, I succumbed to Sherlock Holmes, and I am afraid that masterful detective has influenced my reading as he has influenced my writing ever since. It was Sherlock Holmes that brought me down to earth, back into my own time, and gave me an interest in human activities no less mysterious and frequently more amusing than matters beyond our space and time. Therefore, I became a reader of detective stories concerned only with this planet, and I have remained so almost to this day. For years, science fiction was forgotten, save it was occasionally written by Sir Arthur. So, tell the truth, what little I read of it after Doyle and Wells bored me considerably, and I suspect that much of it was pretty awful. But something has been happening to the detective story of late, in America at least. Perhaps Hammett is responsible for the change, or possibly it has been natural development of our time, the inevitable result of teaching the wrong people to read and write. Hammett, a master, should have remained unique. His successors and imitators in the Federal Union, with a few horrible exceptions, have been, in my opinion, almost maliciously bad. The classic detective story is still written and sometimes written well, particularly in England, but for the most part, the romance of crime and its detection has degenerated as a work of art until it is a misnomer to call it a detective story. So, at any rate, it seems to me that in consequence of my waning admiration for the detective story, I have been coquetting with an earlier love. I have been reading science fantasy again, experimentally, and find it on its higher levels as satisfying as any other fiction now being written. On its lower levels, it is just the same old tripe. But in recent years, a new group of little masters has appeared in the field, which work in the short story has been notable to say the least. That John Collier can be named among them uh, indicates the quality of the field at its best, but at the moment the only historically important, and that is on, but at the moment that is only historically important. Sorry, I had the cough. Uh, unhappily, Mr. Collier appears to have stopped writing, and that is a circumstance that should be discussed after the biblical fashion from the housetops. Nevertheless, some unusual talents remain, for example, Ray Bradbury and Frederick Brown, to mention two gentlemen of letters whom I particularly admire. Possibly they and half dozen others will write the detective stories of the future, for it is in the direction of science fiction it seems to me that the detective story is headed. For early examples of this mixed genre, I recommend two stories between these covers: Mr. Brown's Mouse and Private Eye by Henry Kuttner. When you have read two more engaging and more enlightening texts, it appears to many students of popular literature that science fiction is taking over the popularity of the detective story, and indeed the phenomenon is too conspicuous to be overlooked. The reason for this reversal is simple. Better stories on the whole are being written just now in the science fiction field than in the field of crime and detection. The decline of the detective story is partly responsible for the change, but the arrival of the atomic age made it inevitable. The new age did not, of course, create science fiction as a literary type. It simply stimulated a new desire for it that the sentient writer and publisher were quick to meet. Happily, among the hordes of professional writers, good, bad, and indifferent, who hastened to respond to the demand, were a few of were a few men of exceptional talent. It is with these men that this introduction is concerned. Broadly, science fiction and its related or associated story types, fantasy, supernatural, magic, dreads, and tolls of almost every description, are as old as man's dreams, man's fears, man's curiosity, in a word, man's thinking. Their long growth into a department of literary art or artifice parallels the history of man's mind. Once they are all just mystery stories, Once they were all just mystery stories, but the modern categories overlap, confusing, and drive bibliographers mad. Science fiction, I believe, by strict definition, is fiction based on accepted scientific principles, after which gesture to science and the accepted principles and the pop eyed reader are taken for a ride. I suspect that much of science fiction science is as imaginary as the beautiful heroine in the magazine stories. But that is all right with me. A good story is a good story, and as far as I'm concerned, it is all in fun. Recently browsing in the bibliographical history of the detective story and playing with my own collection of illustrative texts, it occurred to me that it would be interesting to ascertain where science fiction and the detective story began to overlap. That pre-Poe specimens of the mixed genre exist was clear enough, but the research quickly languished and exists only in the form of a few indecipherable notes. It is a project better suited to a younger man, some young fellow with a lifetime ahead of him. All this is a far cry from our immediate considerations. It should be noted, however, that writers of importance before Poe, known for their pseudoscience fantasies, were attracted to the detective story and experimented with the form before Poe got around to inventing it. Relevant specimens are to be found in the works of such weird writers as E.T.A. Hoffman and William Hoff, and probably dozens of others. As a matter of fact, I before the inquiry could be conducted, will with modest success among the earliest Gothics. Um, all Gothics are written around crimes, murders, kidnappings, and attempted rapes, embezzlements, imprisonments, and assorted ruffianry. Very pleasing to readers of their day, and their preposterous riddles are usually explained on rational grounds by somebody who may be called a detective. There is no true detection as such, and no true science as such, yet a change of stress might make many an old Gothic brimming with phony supernatural gimmicks into a detective tale. It seems to be noteworthy also that since Poe, most of the masters in the field of scientific extravaganza have also written detective stories and vice versa. Among these may be mentioned Wilkie Collins, J. Sheridan Le Fanu, Robert Louis Stevenson, Arthur Conan Doyle, Arthur Machen, G.K. Chesterly, and notably in our own day John Collier and the ingenious Mr. H.F. Hurd. We might also add Frederick Brown, Ray Bradbury, Henry Kuttner, Louis Pageant, and S. Fowler Wright. There is obviously much in the two-story types to attract writers and readers in both fields. I mean to lure practitioners or addicts of the one field into another. Essentially, I take it both types are intellectually aimed by the best writers anyway, and both often achieve much the same effect with much the same build-up of mystery and suspense. Both have their allegorical overtones for those who care to seek them, but there is no need to go into that. Speaking for myself, I like them if they simply tell a good story with literary art. Many readers of the detective story, and some good writers too, believe that the possibilities of that fiction have been exhausted. Every twist of plot would appear to have been used. They say the gimmicks are running out. The 13 original situations, or whatever number they may be, have been employed until they are threadbare. But the frontiers of science fiction, it is urged, are unlimited. There are no boundaries to the imagination. Until we reach Mars, we can write about Mars as we please. I don't entirely argue. It all depends on the writer and the quality of his thinking and the way he puts words together. A good writer of detective stories can still do a grand job with the old situations and the old gimmicks. It is largely a matter of virtuosity, and science, in any case, is not just a conspiracy for reaching Mars. It's more practical activities on the planet in the fields of technology, chemistry, medicine, psychiatry, and a dozen other fields are furnishing new gimmicks every day. But there is no doubt that such considerations as these suggested above are bringing some fine new writers into the science fiction field, and it is all the good. Not all of them will be seduced by rocket journeys to Mars or the moon, although probably that is what the public wants. Some of them will write the new kind of detective stories, and they will be as good, if not better, than some of the old ones. But all of which I mean only that readers who may be as annoyed as I am by the phony whodunits, sex orgies, and comic carnivals that are now called detective stories may find, as I have found, an excellent substitute in the best examples of science fiction. They are good stories, some of them are superb stories. I am glad to have discovered them, or perhaps I should say rediscovered them. Arthur Machen puts it all this way, quote, "Man is so made that all his true delight arises from the contemplation of mystery, and save by his own frantic and invincible folly, mystery is never taken from him. It rises within his soul, a well of joy unending." End quote. These have been the musings of a large North American mammal, in brackets male, permanently ambushed behind reading glasses. He has never been in an airplane, let alone a rocket, and he has no desire to visit Mars or the moon or any other unearthly goal postulated by science or science fiction, except in a book. He is strictly an armchair adventurer. He likes to read stories in which things happen and then keep on happening. He thinks that reading a good story is more fun than anything, almost. He believes the stories that follow will repay your attention. I found that very, very interesting. I have read some of the author's Vincent Starrett's sort of columns. and other essays on books, and I've always found them interesting. And I really found this interesting because I love the introductions, and it's usually by the editors. A lot of, or at least a lot of times, the editors uh, of the anthology. And in this case, they've brought somebody else out. And for a good part of it, he's talking about crime novels, mystery novels. And I love the way he talks about it. That there's a similarity in how the reader responds to each. Um, and yeah, there's other things that I disagree with and agree with. There are things that are obviously of the time, um, because he's dealing with science fiction that has yet to experience other things, which will be coming in the next decades, that which sort of changed science fiction very much so. But you can see it in here where he talks about that the mystery and science fiction are blending together at times, and that's a foreshadowing of so many different types of genre, especially pure fantasy being um, meshed with science fiction and blurring the edges at times as well. Anyway, I thought that was very good. I was wondering if anybody else had thoughts of this. It just was great, and I just want to show again the dust jacket here of this. I just love these Grayson and Grayson ones, and they publish a lot of stuff, but a lot of it's expensive, and then some of these are dirt cheap. Anyway, thank you, BookTube, and I will see you next time.